New Thinking Aloud is presented by the California Institute for Human Science, a fully accredited university offering distant learning graduate degrees that focus on mind, body, and spirit. The topics that we cover here. We are particularly excited to announce new degrees emphasizing parapsychology and the paranormal. Visit their website at cihs.edu.
Thinking Aloud. Conversations on the leading edge of knowledge and discovery with psychologist Jeffrey Mishlove.
Hello and welcome. I'm Jeffrey Mishlove. On New Thinking Aloud, I'm sure if you're a regular viewer, you know that we've done many interviews on the topic of precognition and that parapsychologists believe the data for precognition is very strong, possibly stronger than real-time telepathy or ESP. Today we're going to examine the implications of this finding. We're going to be looking at the possibility that humanity as a whole has been precognizing its own future and that this has an impact in the world of social affairs and politics. My guest is Stephan Schwartz, who is a distinguished associated scholar of the California Institute for Human Science. He is also a columnist for the journal Explore and editor of the daily web publication, The Schwartz Report, in which he covers trends that are affecting the future. He is one of a small group that created modern remote viewing. In addition to his nonfiction books and novels, he is the author of more than 250 technical reports, papers, academic book chapters, prefaces, and introductions. He is the recipient of the Parapsychological Association Outstanding Contribution Award, and he was featured in Germany's magazine's list of 100 most inspiring people in the world. His books include The Secret Vaults of Time, Opening to the Infinite, The Alexandria Project, and The 8 Laws of Change. He also edited the volume called Is Consciousness Primary? Stephan lives in the state of Washington, and now I'll switch over to the internet video. Welcome, Stephan. It is a pleasure to be with you once again.
My pleasure, Jeff. Glad to join you.
We're going to be talking about a concept that I think you've really pioneered. And it's sort of obvious to me, given all of the enormous data of precognition, that it must be having an unconscious impact on humanity as a whole. And you have drilled down on this in an editorial scheduled for publication in the journal Explore. I'm glad that the listeners and viewers of New Thinking Aloud will be able to preview this idea. And there are basically two essential factors that most people think would be completely unrelated, and you are tying them together. Obviously, one of them everybody seems to be aware at this point. Even if they're a disbeliever, they know that a lot of people accept the data for global warming. And the other trend that you've identified is the trend towards more and more authoritarian governments around the world.
Yes, it is, I think, quite alarming, actually. You look at what just happened in South Korea. They're trying to arrest the president. You look at what's happening in Germany. You look at the collapse of the Macron government. You look at what's going on in Georgia. Throughout the world, democracies are disappearing. And if you look at the chart that I sent you, you can see that after World War II, because of the horror of World War II and just a few years earlier, World War I, democracies became the focus of many countries, building democracies. And they, from 45 up into about 2001, democracies were on the increase, and now they are on the decrease. The Varieties of Democracy Institute at the University of Gothenburg in Sweden, which is one of the few places that even studies this, has published papers that the Institute's director reports, and this is a quote, "A democratic decline has taken place globally, and an increasing number of people are living in closed autocracies. The level of democracy enjoyed by the average world citizen in 2022 is back to 1986 levels, and that means that 72% of the world's population, 5.7 billion people, today live under authoritarian rule, and that was in 2022. So it's actually worse today. And it is a international trend that I've been studying for over 30 years, since I was appointed by Mel Laird to the Secretary of Defense MIT discussion or study group on innovation, technology, and the future. You know, that was back in the 70s, and at that time, what the futurists were all concerned about was we were going to run out of raw materials and resources, and we'd be overpopulated. And of course, that's not the issue at all. They didn't even think about climate change. But they just assumed democracies would keep growing. Wilton Dillon, who was the director, also put me on the Smithsonian, appointed me to the Smithsonian study group on innovation technology. So I got to know most of the futurists at that time that were, nationally known. And nobody was talking about climate change or the decrease in democracy. It just never occurred to them because what they saw was an increase. But no, this is a huge problem. And in fact, you could argue that in about 2 weeks, we're going to become a kind of pseudo-democracy. So, I mean, Americans are not going to get away without being affected by this.
Well, when you use the phrase pseudo-democracy, I think you're referring to a trend that this organization in Gothenburg has detected, which are countries that hold elections, but they're not really democracies at all. The elections are, in effect, they're rigged. And the winners of the elections are authoritarian rulers who typically control the media and control all the levers of government so that it has the ostensible form of a democracy, but only the appearance.
That is exactly correct. You look at Hungary, they have elections. Look at Russia, they have elections. The pseudo-democracy movement, that's what I call it. I don't know that other people use that, but in any case, these pseudo-democracies, Hungary is a good example, Turkey's one. They just exactly as you're saying, they hold elections, but they're completely rigged. They know how they're going to come out. And it's just, it's a sort of stylistic democracy, but not a substantial one. And of course, what interested me is why is this happening? What makes people become or allow an authoritarian government to come to power? Because if you look at it historically, and just what's going on currently, you can see that these authoritarian governments don't come to power because of violence, civil violence. They get voted into power. And why do people vote authoritarians into government? I mean, you would think it was obvious that it's not in your best interest. But they do, and I think the answer is because there is a growing humanity-wide precognition of fear that something is causing massive change. And it's not that so much that it's conscious, it's a kind of unconscious gut feeling that, well, you know, as you and I know, in the consciousness world, we call that precognition. But it's this unconscious conviction that something is happening that's going to be dreadful and scary. And so people just, you expect, turn to people who tell them, oh, I'll get it fixed. I can take care of it. Don't worry about it. I'm going to make everything okay. And out of their fear, they vote for an authoritarian. I mean, that's how Hitler came to power. It's how Mussolini came to power. So it's, we're at a transitional, scary time, I think. And so I began looking, what is it that's going on that's causing this? Why are people choosing this kind of leadership? And I think the answer is because of what climate change is going to do. And if we look at Los Angeles, as you and I are talking, people we know, friends who live in Los Angeles in Pacific Palisades, are losing their houses. If you look at people who live in Florida along the coastline, they can't get insurance. And so people are beginning to become aware of this. They don't talk about it so much, but they just have this gut feeling. And I think that's what's driving all this.
Well, you and I are both familiar with a line of research in parapsychology that's been quite successful. It's called presentiment. It's a form of precognition, but the interesting thing is that the body seems to register a signal from the future or a future event that's about to be presented to an experimental subject in the laboratory. It could be detected through blood pressure or galvanic skin response or some other physiological measurement, but the person isn't even consciously aware of this at all. The person has no conscious identification of what the body has picked up.
Yes, it's because we have grown up, have been a culture of materialism with the idea that consciousness is based entirely on the neurophysiology of your anatomy. That isn't true. And you and I both know that. There's tons of research on this. But what's going on is that once you recognize that there is continuity of consciousness, that the consciousness existed before you incarnated, that an aspect of consciousness, what I call the eternal self, what religion calls the soul, will continue after physical death. You won a very large prize for writing an essay on this. And but this continuity of consciousness has a corollary, and that is that consciousness, we live in a matrix of consciousness, and that this matrix is interconnected and interdependent. Now, if you look at the latest research that's going on in disciplines, nothing to do with parapsychology, and in fact, I should say to you, I do research in 7 different disciplines and publish in 7 different disciplines. So much of this is going on without much recognition in the consciousness or in the parapsychological world. But we know, for instance, I mean, who would believe that fungus have memories, they make decisions, They solve problems. They're interconnected. Research that was done by a researcher named Yu Fukasawa, a professor at the Graduate School of Agricultural Science in Tohoku University, said, and again, this is a quote. I mean, these people are very clear about this. He says, you'd be surprised at just how capable such fungi are. They have memories, they learn, they make decisions. Quite frankly, the differences in how they solve problems compared to humans is mind-blowing. So when I went to work for National Geographic, when I got out of university, the first story I was asked to do was about the migration of the monarch butterflies. Now, at this point, I didn't know anything about consciousness. I guess I was a materialist. I hadn't actually really thought about it. And one of the things that really struck me was that monarch butterflies who migrate every year, go about 2,500 miles from northern United States, lower Canada, all the way down into Mexico, that these monarch butterflies, first of all, they do this every year. But second of all, and this was the thing I could not believe, and I went and interviewed scientists, this is back in the early 60s, and that was that the monarch butterflies go and they land in the same tree that their parents landed in. And when the next generation does it, they also land in the same tree. And every night, and if that tree gets cut down, the next generation picks a new tree, and then it goes on like that. And I said to one of the scientists that I interviewed to do this article for National Geographic, how in the world could you know that? And he told me, well, we tag the monarch butterflies. They have little tags. And so we track them, and therefore we know where they land. And the same thing we know now, the gorillas some gorillas have an IQ of about 85. The average IQ in the United States is 98. The 34% of us are between 98 and 85. So there are gorillas that are as smart as some humans. Octopuses, when I was doing the project down in the Bahamas, the Briggleander project, Seaview, I developed a relationship with an octopus. And I couldn't get over the fact he clearly recognized me and would come down and I would hold a piece of fish and he would take it out of my hand and stroke my arm with his tentacle. But when other divers went down to do it, he wouldn't come out. He wouldn't come near them. And that research, which I just stumbled across, has been replicated now. So what we're beginning to learn is that all beings have some level of consciousness and that this is all interconnected and interdependent. And the reason that people have this presentiment problem, that is, they physiologically respond even though they're not mentally aware of it, is, I think, because we live in a continuity of consciousness, matrix of consciousness, all over the earth, and all the beings of earth are a part of it.
I have recently come across a book by the philosopher Robert Temple in which he proposes that giant clouds of plasma that exist between the Earth and the Moon at the Lagrange points, there are two huge clouds larger than the Earth itself, and that these clouds of plasma are showing properties of conscious entities. They're not even molecular. They are, well, there may be dust particles mixed in with plasma, which are just ions, essentially. He's suggesting that these could be conscious beings far more powerful than any computer here on Earth.
Yes, well, I mean, as I said, once you get the idea, Max Planck in 1931 was interviewed by the Observer newspaper. A reporter was sent to interview him. And Planck didn't give a lot of interviews. He wasn't, he just wasn't a guy that talked to media a lot. Anyway, they asked him, what have you learned? You're the father of quantum mechanics. What have you learned? And he said, I don't know what they thought he was going to say, something about molecules or fields or I don't know. But anyway, what he said was, what I've learned is that consciousness is causal and fundamental. Space-time, here we are. Space-time arises from consciousness, not consciousness from space-time. So in a sense, we're in a kind of computer game with avatars, because the real key to this thing is that consciousness is the causal part. Everything was created by intentioned consciousness. Now, who did that? I don't have any idea, but the two great mystery questions that I have been studying now for over 60 years, what is consciousness and what is information? Because I think my belief is, and I believe the evidence supports it, is that what we are looking at is an information phenomena in which intentioned consciousness creates information architectures, and some of them are part of what we call space-time, but not all of them. And because of this continuity of consciousness, we know from the reincarnation research, we know from the near-death research, we know from mediumistic research where people like Bly Bond, who reconstructed the Glastonbury Cathedral by doing automatic writing that was channeled with another guy, supposedly from the monks who had built Glastonbury Cathedral in England. And he reconstructed it and found things that no one had any idea were there. I interviewed men who had worked for him, Frederick Bly Bond, and they said he'd come out in the morning and he would say, I want you to go over in that field and keep walking till I tell you to stop. Okay, now right there, now start digging and you're going to find and whatever it was. And they did. And these men who were now old men, I said, how did he know that? And they said, we never understood it. But what I think all of this is telling us is that consciousness is causal and fundamental, and that we are all interconnected and interdependent, and that what's going on now with humanity is that there is this presentiment without conscious awareness, but there is this fear. And we even are beginning to develop experimental research, which I think is very important. You and I both know Roger Nelson, who created the Global Consciousness Project, where he's got random number generators all over the world. And what he's discovered is that when a group of people focus on something that has emotional stimulus, that these random number generators go non-random. And he's been doing it for years. And, what's happening there, it's not that people are aware in the sense that that's what they're focused on, but they have an awareness of it, even if they don't even know about it. And because we live in a matrix of consciousness that is interdependent and interconnected, these things, we literally change the nature of reality, what Einstein called an optical delusion. I like that. When they asked, after talking to Planck, they asked Einstein, he said, well, it's an optical delusion. Anyway, I think that what's happening is we are beginning to become aware of.
Well, when you talk about a random event generator, and I know we're talking about quantum mechanical devices that are based on quantum tunneling, if they go non-random when an event like the death of Princess Diana or the 9/11 attack and so on occurs, it suggests to me that there's you could call it a field of global consciousness that exists at the quantum level or even the pre-quantum level, what some people call the quantum foam, the probability foam that precedes quantum events that people theorize is related to consciousness itself, and that humanity as a whole has an unconscious perception of future events, because these deviations from randomness are often detected in advance of the specific event that occurs.
Yes, that's very important. I've been doing for 45 years, starting in 1978, I have been getting people to remote view the same date as the day they do it, only in the year 2050 or 2060. And they, for instance, I mean, obviously you can't evaluate everything because it hadn't happened yet, because it's exactly the point you're making. It's precognitive. So, but for instance, I got interested in doing this project because I had those appointments. I was special assistant to the chief of naval operations, and I was on those future committees that I'd mentioned to you, the study groups. And I had just left government, and while I had been in government, I had very high clearances to do the work that I was doing. And I came out of government to focus on consciousness research, and partly for that reason, convinced we were going to have a nuclear war. And in fact, everybody that was in the geopolitical world who held those kind of clearances thought it's inevitable because somebody will make a mistake. And in fact, were it not for one Soviet colonel, Stanislav Petrov, we would have had a third world war, a nuclear war, because this guy was sitting in front of radars and part of their defense system, and he saw what was originally thought to be American missiles coming into the Soviet Union. This is back in the Soviet period. And he was told to push the button. And he wouldn't do it because he realized the implications of what that would be. And they sent out people to arrest him because he wouldn't do what he was told. And by the time they got there, they realized that no, there were no missiles, that this was a malfunction. So, I came out of this, this is in 77, and I thought we were going to have a nuclear war. So I had a little girl, a daughter, and I thought, my God, what kind of world is she going to live in? And so I had started doing what today we call remote viewing research. I called it back then, this is 1968. I had started doing what I call distant viewing. Both of them are terrible terms because they have nothing to do with viewing and nothing to do with remote or any of that. But that term was coined by Ingo Swann, and it's caught on, but it's not a very good term. But anyway, so I started asking people to remote view this the same date in either 2050 or 2060. And they told me, for instance, now you think about this, you have to go back into the 70s. It's the height of the Cold War. They said to me, I said, well, do we have a nuclear war? They said, no. I said, well, then what's happened with the Soviet Union? Oh, it doesn't exist. I know, what do you mean it doesn't exist? This was a bipolar world in terms of the Cold War. Why do you mean it doesn't exist? I went around and I talked to a friend of mine who was the head of the CIA, Stansfield Turner, and I said, do you know anything that would make the Soviet Union disappear? He said, no. And another one of these things, I asked him about healthcare because I care about that. And I think we don't have very good healthcare in the in fact, we have terrible healthcare in the United States. Anyway, I said, well, tell me about healthcare. And they told me about what I now recognize. I didn't understand it then as the CRISPR technology, that is genetic manipulation. But in any case, I said, well, are people healthy and all that? They said, oh, well, yeah, but there's going to be a series of pandemics. I said, pandemics? I'm thinking 1918 Spanish flu. They said, yeah, the first one will be a blood disease that crosses over from primates in Africa to humans, and it's going to kill millions of people. And I went around to a friend of mine who was the deputy director of National Institutes of Health. I said, do you know anything about a blood disease that crosses over? This is 1979. Do you know anything about a blood disease that could cross over from primates to humans in Africa and that had the potential to kill millions of people? And he said to me, Stephan, I don't know what you're smoking, but you should quit. And then that just laughed at me. And of course, in 1981, the first case of HIV, and then it killed 35 million people. And then came SARS and H5N1, and now we've just gone through COVID. And we're going to do others because the bacteria and the viruses are mutating to accommodate the change caused by climate change. So we're just getting started on this. But in any case, that was the kind of thing that people were telling me. And I thought, how could that be true? They said to me, for instance, I was about to buy General Motors at that time had just issued an electric vehicle, and I was thinking about buying one. And but I thought about how am I going to charge this thing? And everybody was talking about sort of building another kind of gas station model where you had charging stations. And I asked remote viewers, and they said, well, yeah, that's how it starts out, but that's not what happens. They build roads that will literally charge the vehicles that drive over them. And that's what's happening now. I mean, it's not, you have to follow this fairly closely in detail to know this, but there are already places in the United States and in other countries where Sweden, where they're building roads that charge the vehicles that drive over them. So I began this project, do this remote viewing of the future, and they began to talk to me about what I now recognize as climate change. I didn't understand it. I was, for instance, in Santa Monica doing an interview with someone. I'd spoken at a conference, and I was doing a bunch of people. And I said to them, go forward in time to the same date. And he said, well, I can't. And I said, why not? And he said, well, I'd be underwater. I said, what do you mean you'd be underwater? He said, well, large parts of Santa Monica and Manhattan Beach and other beaches areas are underwater. I said, why? He said, well, I don't know, because the sea rose. And I went around to a friend who was one of the major climatologists in the country, and I said to him, do you know anything about this? And he said, same thing I had been told about the pandemics. He said, that is nonsense. And then, of course, it isn't, because it's happening. So these were all precognitive, but not really recognized by people until they were deliberately questioned, responses that people had. And I think that, as we've been talking, that what's going on is that people have this precognitive awareness of what climate change is going to do to their area. And they are having a physiological response, a psychological response, even though they aren't really conscious of why.
You know, we've done many interviews on this channel that touch on the research of J.W. Dunn, who wrote the book An Experiment with Time, I think back in the 1920s, examining his own dreams. And he determined, and this has been replicated, I know, a few times. We've recently interviewed Eric Wargo, who did his own replication of this research. He looked at his dreams to determine whether the dreams were influenced by events from his own past as opposed to future events. And Dunn found, and Wargo and others have confirmed, that it's about 50-50. We're influenced from the future as much as from the past.
Yes. Well, I mean, let me give you another one. Jules Verne wrote, and this is in the 19th century, Jules Verne wrote, 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea?
About a submarine.
Wildly popular at the time. So he had a series of dreams, and he wrote a second book, and it was about Paris in the 1960s. And in this book, he said that there were no horse-drawn carriages. People drove around in vehicles that ran on energy. And he said the city of Paris was now known because there was a huge metal tower that had become the symbol of the city. And that corporations controlled the economy, and that women worked in these corporations. And I love this one, and that business information was transmitted by facsimile machines. Anyway, he wrote this book up, Paris in the 60s, and he sent it to his editor, who was also a friend. And he wrote back, the editor, and said, Jules, I'm not going to publish this book. This is nonsense. It will destroy your reputation. Nobody will believe any of this. And my suggestion is you just put it away and forget about it. And that's what he did. And then in the early 1990s, an heir to Verne inherited a country property from him, or descended from him, and he went up to see it, and underneath a table was a little safe in the barn. And he said to the tenant farmer, "What's in the safe?" And the guy said, "I don't know. My father, it's been there. My dad, we don't know how to open it. We never really thought about it. It's just, we can't open it." So he had a guy come up from Paris to get it open. And in it, he found this correspondence between Jules Verne and his editor, and this manuscript that described all of these precognitive things that had started as a series of dreams, which became a book which described quite accurately what Paris would be like in the 1960s. So yes, I think if you look at history, you can see that people have known about what we call non-local consciousness. I mean, that's what the oracles of the Greek world were, the 7 oracles. The oldest remote viewing we have a record of is in the 46th chapter of Herodotus's Histories of the World. Herodotus is a Greek who is considered the father of history. Or the Chinese, or the talking idol of Siwa, the Egyptians, or the talking idol of Ixchel, which was the Mayans. The Etruscans had a school of what today we would call remote viewing that was so impressive that after the Romans conquered the Etruscans, we're talking back in the 700s of BCE, they kept it going because the results were so successful. So it's clear that humans have known that there was an aspect of consciousness that was not restricted to space and time. They had different beliefs about what it was and all of that, but they recognized that there was something going on that linked people together, and that people could describe events that had not yet occurred. And today, I think we're just now beginning to grapple and understand what that is. That this fact that we live in a matrix of consciousness that is interdependent and interconnected, not only between ourselves, but with all the other beings of the earth. And as you say, possibly even these, I don't want to use the word fields because that's a space-time word. And I don't know, the evidence, I don't think is clear what the role of quantum mechanics is, if it has a role. I personally think it might play a role in the non-local becoming local. We do know, for instance, that there's some research that suggests that the non-local becomes aware locally within the anterior superior temporal gyrus, the prefrontal cortex.
Let's talk about the extinction of species. That's pretty huge. I mean, we are impacted when a single human being dies. The poet John Donne wrote that great poem, For Whom the Bell Tolls. When you hear the bell tolling, don't ask for whom it tolls for you. But how about when an entire species goes extinct?
Well, the International Union for Conservation of Nature says that 46,300 of Earth's species are threatened with extinction. That's about 28% of the 157,190 species that are listed in the UCN's red list of species threat. But it's going to be everything from birds to trees to amphibians. You know, I read a story in the research literature. As I said, I read in 7 different disciplines, and I read a story yesterday that the swallows are getting smaller wings so that they're not caught as they fly through bridges and things by cars, because the smaller wings make them a little more agile. That elephants are now being born without tusks, because the tusks are what people captured. They killed the elephant in order to get the tusk. So now elephants are being born without tusks. So what we're seeing is not only the potential that tens of thousands of species are threatened with extinction, but also that they are mutating in order to accommodate the circumstances that humanity has done to the planet. And my interest is and has been since the 1960s, when I woke up, when I was 23, 24 years old, is fostering well-being. Because one of the things that you learn when you really do the research is that fostering well-being always produces better outcomes than any other option. And we, unfortunately, are a country that is now governed by greed and the quest for power. And that's why we have such bad health care. It's why 54% of Americans can't read past the 6th grade level, 43% can't read past the 5th grade level, why we're so innumerate that many people can't calculate a percentage or do a fraction. We are destroying the institutions that foster well-being. We are doing what the founders did not want us to do. Life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. the founders had lots of problems, slavery and all of that, but they still had this idea that the point of society was to function to foster well-being. And we seem to have lost that. And that's why all this is going on. That's why climate change is occurring. And I think, as we have been discussing, there is an awareness of what's going to happen. And it is so threatening that it is what's driving people to authoritarianism, because they want somebody to say, oh, yeah, I can get it fixed. Don't worry about it. I know how to do that. And that's what the United States, that's what we just did in our last election. And Project 2025 says nothing about climate change. And I don't think many people even believe that climate change exists. And yet there is this presentiment, and it is going to cause the extinction of thousands of species of everything on Earth. And it is creating these authoritarian governments. And I think the only thing that's going to change it is when each of us as individuals choose to make every decision of the options available to us be a decision that is the most compassionate, life-affirming, and fostering of well-being. And I know that this will work, because if you look between 1906 and 2006, you will see that more countries prospered because they were democracies that fostered well-being than any other form of government. And so it's up to us. And we know from work that was done at the Van Rensselaer Polytech Institute that when 10% of any society changes its view on a consciousness, on something in consciousness, that the whole culture has to accommodate that. And you can see it. I mean, when you and I were boys, you went to someone's house, there was a coffee on the coffee table in the living room, there was an ashtray and a cigarette lighter and maybe a pack of cigarettes. You never see that anymore. Why? Nobody passed a law about it, but it's because people's consciousness changed. So if we're going to produce a different society, we have to choose as individuals. And I hope that's the takeaway that people will take from this interview, this conversation. Every day you are faced with dozens of little decisions. The things you buy, the companies you go to, whatever, and that you always choose of the options available to you, the one that is the most compassionate, life-affirming, and fostering of well-being.
Stephan, I agree with everything you've said, especially the importance of fostering well-being. However, based on our discussion of precognition, I'm puzzled because it seems to me there might be another alternative way of interpreting all the data that we've been laying out for our viewers, and that is, what if humanity as a whole is precognizing an event so disastrous, even beyond climate change, something like a global nuclear war or worse, and something so severe that human well-being becomes subservient to human survival. And the thought subconsciously is that in order to survive, humanity is going to need strong leaders who can make decisions by themselves and not be hampered by all the impediments that a democracy imposes on decision-making.
I don't agree with any of that. And in the remote viewing that I'm doing, what I will tell you, is that between 2040 and 2045, something is going to happen that is truly cataclysmic. I didn't know what it was, and I didn't have enough sense to ask remote viewers to give it to me in detail. They just said something happens that changes the whole world. Now, the good news is that by 2060, the 2060 people, and the reason I started doing 2050 and then went to 2060 was I wanted to see what happened on the other side of this 2040 to 2045 crisis. And the 2060s tell me that they live in a different world. Smaller communities, healthcare is completely changed. Race is no longer an issue. Gender is no longer an issue. That there is a form of democracy, but it is quite different than this. That the United States still exists, but that power has principally devolved to the states and groups of states that have joined together. That people don't travel a lot. That healthcare is completely changed. That because of genetic manipulation, a lot of diseases have been dealt with. So I think what's going to happen is we're going to get more authoritarian. We're not properly preparing for climate change. Between 2040 and 2045, we're going to have this crisis, which I believe is actually a combination of things. Climate change, could it be a nuclear war? Yeah, although that's not what people tell me, but yes. And I will tell you also, Jeff, that to the degree that I can evaluate the accuracy of this data, it is 83% accurate. And interestingly enough, that corresponds very closely to the precognitive applied parapsychology, remote viewing archaeological projects that I've done, which have over 50 years, have a accuracy rate of between 78 and 93%. So currently my evaluation is 83%. So I repose considerable confidence in this. It's going to be a radically different world. As I said, smaller communities, the architecture looks more like Scandinavian architecture, much simpler. People work very differently. Was not insightful enough to ask how many species have died, because, when you're asking people to look at something 30 or 40 years in the future, the problem is you can't go too much. The reason I chose those dates is that if you go too far into the future, like Jules Verne's thing, almost 100 years, you don't understand what they're saying. And I didn't understand a lot of what people were saying to me back in the 70s, 80s, 90s. When they talked about climate change, they didn't call it that. They just said the weather has changed and, this part of Florida has disappeared. And how could it disappear? But I think we are going to survive. I think we are going to become a very different species. We are going to make different choices because we are going to go through a crisis that is so dramatic, and it's only, 15 years out, that we re-personify or readjust our societies, just as the American Revolution changed the entire structure of the colonial society. I think we're going to see the same thing. So I do not think authoritarianism is going to prevail. I think it's going to grow. But on the other side of this 2040, 2045 catastrophe, we make different choices. So I don't know whether you and I will be around for that, but I think that that's what's going to happen. And it actually makes me a little happier about my grandchildren.
Well, Stephan Schwartz, once again, this has been an eye-opening conversation. It's always a pleasure to talk to you. You are one of my heroes in parapsychology for the pioneering work that you've been doing for more than half a century. It's always a pleasure to be with you, Stephan. Thank you so much.
My pleasure as well, Jeff. These conversations, as I have told you a number of times, I believe are going to become historically important, and historians in the future will be writing doctoral dissertations on these interviews that you do. And I applaud what you have done, because I think, I read Newton and I ask myself, why did he find gravity and these metaphysical interests he had equally important? But he left no documents, and so we don't know. But now, because of these interviews you're doing, people will, in this future time, they will see how we thought and how we got to where we are. So thank you very much.
Once again, thank you, Stephan. And for those of you listening or watching, thank you for being with us, because you are the reason that we are here.
Book 3 in the new Thinking Aloud dialogue series is UFOs and UAP, Are We Really Alone? Now available on Amazon.
You can now download a free PDF copy of issue number 8 of the New Thinking Aloud magazine, or order a beautiful printed copy. Go to newthinkingaloud.org